Part 1. History of U.S. Public Lands. Understanding U.S. Public Lands. U.S. public lands came into existence as a critical compromise, allowing the original Articles of Confederation to be transformed into the U.S. Constitution. The public domain once stretched from the Appalachian Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. Of the 1.8 billion acres of public land acquired by the United States, 2/3 went to individuals, corporations, and the states. What remained has been set aside for national forests, wildlife refuges, national parks and monuments, Bureau of Land Management lands, and other public purposes. These lands provide timber, minerals, hydrocarbons, rangelands, water resource protection, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, recreation, and solace for people from all 50 states and from around the world. Who owns the U.S. public lands is at the heart of the transfer of public lands movement. While pro-transfer proponents portray the transfer movement as an effort to return these lands to their rightful owners, the rightful owners are the citizens of the United States, represented by their elected representatives to Congress, acting under the authority of the U.S. Constitution Property Clause, which states, "The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States." Currently, approximately 640 million acres of surface land are managed by the federal government, accounting for nearly 28% of the 2.3 billion acres of land in the 50 states and District of Columbia. 4 federal land management agencies administer 608 million acres, about 95% of these federal lands. These agencies are the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Most of these public lands are in the West, where the percentage of U.S. ownership is significantly higher than elsewhere in the nation. What became the United States of America was originally inhabited by indigenous populations with land use practices that were already thousands of years old when Europeans arrived. European powers obtained land title via conquest over American Indians. In the eastern United States, the 13 original colonies then obtained title from Great Britain following the Revolutionary War. Throughout the history of this country, the United States government has developed policies for its public lands that include acquisition, disposition, and retention. The first public lands were created in 1781 when New York agreed to surrender to the federal government its claim to unsettled territory extending westward to the Mississippi River. The other colonies followed New York's lead, and by 1802, all territory west of the original 13 colonies, from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, became public domain lands owned by the federal government. West of the Mississippi River, lands were primarily acquired by the U.S. government from foreign governments, beginning with the Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803 and continuing through treaties with Great Britain and Spain in 1818 and 1819. Other substantial acquisitions through purchases and treaties occurred between 1846 and 1853 and included the Oregon Country and the Mexican Cession lands, which comprise the land that makes up all or parts of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Texas joined the Union in 1845. In 1812, Congress established the General Land Office to administer the public domain, with the primary purpose of passing public lands into private ownership. By the middle of the 19th century, through the Homestead Act and other disposal policies, most of the land east of the Mississippi River had been settled and developed. As of 1905, there were still almost 450 million acres of the United States that remained unreserved and open to settlement. Of these acres, over 418 million acres were in the 11 contiguous western states, located west of the 100th meridian, where a rain chart from 1872 clearly illustrates the problem with homesteading those lands. The reason the U.S. still owns much of the West is because it was too dry to settle. While most of the accessible land east of the Mississippi River had been settled and developed by the mid-19th century, the land to the west was largely unaltered by Western European influence until the first Mormon pioneers entered the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. At that time, the area belonged to Mexico. Established following the war with Mexico in 1848, the boundaries of the territory of Utah, shown in blue, included most of what now comprises the state of Nevada, all of the western third of today's state of Colorado, and a small corner of what became the state of Wyoming. The proposed state of Deseret is outlined by the dotted line. Between 1868 and 1896, Utah petitioned several times to become a state, and on January 4, 1896, it was admitted into the Union as the 45th state. As part of the Utah Statehood Enabling Act, as well as part of the Utah Constitution, Utah proclaimed that the people inhabiting said proposed state do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof, and that Utah shall not be entitled to any further or other grants of land for any purpose than is expressly provided in this act. According to information at the Utah Division of Archives and Records Service, all land in Utah became part of the public domain when the United States signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with Mexico in 1848. This land came into the possession of the United States government with a clear and undisputed title. No state contested title and no private rights had been established previously. Therefore, every original land title in Utah can be traced to a patent or other document transferring that land from the federal government. Thus, in 1896, Utah entered the Union as a state with over 70% of its landmass owned by the federal or state government. At statehood, Utah received 7.4 million acres as state trust lands. Since 1896, more than one-half of the original trust lands have been sold. Currently, the Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, SITLA, manages over 3.4 million acres, while state sovereign lands encompass almost 1.5 million acres of land. The mix of federal public lands and state lands in Utah and the other western states and how they are managed is complex. Federal lands oftentimes surround state lands, and both the federal government and state governments manage their lands under different mandates. In addition, the different agencies have different missions. While the BLM and U.S. Forest Service are working under the multiple use and sustained yield mandates, which require them to take into account the long-term needs of future generations for renewable and non-renewable resources, most western state land managers work under a mandate of revenue maximization. For example, SITLA works with private business to generate revenue from energy and mineral royalties and real estate and surface development. Although these lands can be open to the public for recreational activities, public access to trust lands can be withdrawn at any time to allow SITLA to meet its constitutional mandate to generate revenue to support trust land beneficiaries. In addition to acquiring public lands and disposing of public lands, federal policy also includes retaining public lands and reserving them for the use of the American people. Public lands, whether under the General Land Office created in 1812 or since 1946 under the Bureau of Land Management, are the lands from which our iconic public spaces are carved. They include everything from Yellowstone National Park, designated by an act of Congress in 1872, to the Bears Ears National Monument established in 2016 by presidential proclamation, and all of the national forests, the majority of which were established using the Forest Reserve Act of 1891. One of the most important methods of reclassifying the purpose of a given piece of public land is the Antiquities Act of 1906. Though the primary goal of the Antiquities Act was to preserve archaeological sites, it has also been frequently used to protect naturally occurring objects, such as the geological features within the Grand Canyon National Monument, established in 1908 by presidential proclamation. Like the Grand Canyon National Monument, that became a national park in 1919 through an act of Congress, Utah Zion National Park began as a national monument set aside in 1909 under authority of the Antiquities Act, and then became a national park in 1919. In 1937, Kolob Canyon was proclaimed a national monument, and in 1956 was added to Zion National Park. The other three national parks in Utah that began as national monuments are Bryce Canyon National Park, established as a national monument in 1924 after the governor of Utah and the Utah legislature lobbied for national protection of the area. Arches National Park, established as a national monument in 1929, and Capitol Reef National Park, established as a national monument in 1937. In 1964, Congress established Canyonlands National Park, the only one of the Mighty Five national parks that did not begin as a national monument, proclaimed by presidential decree using the Antiquities Act. The two newest national monuments in Utah, Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears, are currently part of a legal battle over presidential authority to reduce the size of a national monument established by a previous president. While a president's authority to diminish a national monument has been questioned, there appears to be no dispute that Congress has the authority to do so, a power it has exercised before. Utah government agencies, including the State of Utah, School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, and the Utah Division of State Parks and Recreation, correspondingly manage state trust lands, state sovereign lands, state wildlife reserves, and state parks. State lands comprise 10% of Utah. In Utah and the 10 other western states, outdoor recreation is responsible for $239 billion in consumer spending and nearly 2 million jobs, yielding over $75 billion in wages and salaries. Data shows that Americans and international travelers visit public lands in western states more than 290 million times annually, making western public lands one of the most popular destinations for recreation in the country. And the number of annual visits to public lands in the United States continues to grow. In 2006, the National Park Service saw approximately 81 million visits to national parks in the 11 western states. A decade later, in 2017, the number of visits to national parks had ballooned to over 108 million. Similarly, visitation to the Bureau of Land Management's national monuments has nearly tripled since 2000. In the state of Utah alone, more than 28 million people visit U.S. public lands and Utah state lands every year. Utah outdoor recreation contributes more than $12.3 billion to the economy, employs more than 110,000 people, and is the primary driver behind the tourism industry. Not only does Utah outdoor recreation create $737 million in state and local tax revenues, it is the reason for $3.9 billion in wages and salaries. And 72% of Utahns identify as public lands users, the highest in the nation. In 2013, as a result of the large contribution the industry plays in Utah's economy, Governor Herbert created the Utah Office of Outdoor Recreation. By 2017, however, despite the recognized value of U.S. public lands to Utah's economy, Utah's pro-transfer proponents, with their anti-public lands rhetoric and legislation, cost the state economically. After 20 years in Salt Lake City, the twice-annual Outdoor Retailer Trade Show, which injected $45 million into Utah's economy each year, left Utah for Denver, Colorado. The move came after Utah Governor Herbert refused to halt the state's efforts to transfer U.S. public lands to Utah, nullify the Antiquities Act, and undo Bears Ears National Monument. According to a 2014 report commissioned by the state titled An Analysis of a Transfer of Federal Lands to the State of Utah, two primary concerns regarding the land transfer from the federal government to state government are the cost of managing the lands and whether the state could generate enough revenue to cover that cost. The report indicates what would be lost to the state if the land is transferred out of federal ownership. These lost revenues include federal wages and spending, which are an infusion of outside money into Utah's economy, PLP payments paid to counties to offset loss of tax revenue on U.S. public lands, costs for wildfires, which make up almost 35% of the estimated direct land management costs, and loss of access to key firefighting resources, including trained personnel, a fleet of aircraft, fire dispatch capacity, and aviation support infrastructure, along with deferred maintenance costs of approximately $100 million and abandoned mine openings, 8,000 to 11,000 of them, that need to be inventoried, field validated, and remediated, with 5 to 10% of these openings having associated water quality issues. Per the same report, in order to make up for the loss of federal dollars, mineral revenue produced on public lands, including mineral lease revenue, oil and gas royalties, and coal royalties, would have to be increased. The land transfer could be profitable for the state if oil and gas prices remain stable and high and the state negotiates with the federal government a change in royalty revenue share from 50% to 100%. In addition, land-based revenue and receipts collected by the BLM and U.S. Forest Service, including recreation fees, right-of-way rents, grazing fees, and timber sales receipts, also are a potential source of revenue if the state takes over these lands. But they too would probably need to be increased. While federal agencies are required by law to provide access to lands under their jurisdictions and to manage programs tied to those lands, even without adequate funding, the federal government, by law, can go into debt to support those operations. State governments, however, operate under a balanced budget requirement. If the transfer of U.S. public lands to Utah occurs and the state is unable to make up the hundreds of millions of dollars currently expended by the federal government on U.S. public lands in Utah, the state would either have to raise taxes or sell these lands. Once sold into private ownership, it is unlikely the public would ever get them back. To read the study, view these PowerPoints, and access additional materials, go to the League of Women Voters of Grand County Public Lands Project at my.lwv.org/Utah/Grand-County and click on Public Lands Project in the menu. To continue with this presentation, go to the next set of slides, Part 2, Transfer of U.S. Public Lands.